When a black judge falls from grace, then his daughter fights to expose the corruption behind his downfall. Judge Marcus Bell is accused of bribery, destroying his career. His daughter, Naomi, digs into the corruption behind the charges, but powerful enemies will stop at nothing to silence her. As Naomi uncovers shocking truths, she races against time to clear her father's name and expose the deadly conspiracy. The courtroom was filled with a quiet hum of conversations, a mix of murmurs and shuffling papers. At the front, Judge Marcus Bell sat on the elevated bench, his dark suit sharp against the white marble of the courtroom. His face remained calm, unreadable, as he looked down at the case in front of him. This was a high-profile trial, and everyone in the room knew it would be a turning point. An unflinching judge had earned him the respect of all who had worked with him, yet lately that respect had started to waver. On the other side of the courtroom stood his daughter, Naomi Bell. She had inherited her father's sharp mind and unyielding sense of justice. Naomi had always been proud of her father, but lately there was something in the air that they were dealing with. It was something else. Whispers. Everywhere she went, she could hear the soft, accusing whispers. People were talking about her father in ways that didn't make sense. "Did you hear?" one of the clerks had said that morning. "Judge Bell's name is all over the papers. They're saying he's involved in a bribery scandal." At first, Naomi something like that. It seemed impossible. But now, with every glance from the courtroom staff, every sidelong look from the reporters, she felt the pressure mounting. There was something behind these rumors, something that wasn't adding up. Judge Marcus Bell stood up as the prosecutor began to speak. The rhythm of his voice cutting her father's eyes stayed focused, his face betraying no emotion, but she knew him too well. Something wasn't right. She had seen that look before. It was the same one he wore when he was deeply troubled but refused to show it. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room. Judge Bell nodded as the prosecutor continued, but Naomi's mind wasn't on what was happening outside the courtroom. The rumors, the whispers, the growing belief that her father might be guilty of something. The afternoon sun cast a thin line of light through the window, but it felt distant, as if everything in the room was trapped in its shadow. Naomi sat still, her gaze flicking. A longtime friend of her father's had entered the courtroom earlier, but now, as Naomi scanned the room, she noticed him speaking with a group of reporters by the door. His expression was stern, as if he were making a point. She had always admired Judge Harrison. He and her father had worked together for years, sharing many cases and long discussions over cups of coffee. Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted. Judge Harrison, who had once stood by her father's side through every challenge, was now speaking publicly about justice and integrity at a local event, an event that felt too much like a pointed message aimed at Marcus. Later that evening, Naomi sat in the kitchen at home, the sound of the kettle boiling in the background, and her mother was too quiet, too lost in thought. Naomi turned the pages of the newspaper, scanning the headline, "Judge Bell under investigation for alleged bribery." There it was again. The same words, the same accusations. Naomi knew her father. She knew he wasn't involved in anything illegal. She thought about it. She couldn't. The more she realized that someone wanted to bring him down. And Naomi wasn't about to let it happen without finding out the truth. She reached for her phone, dialed a number, and waited for the line to connect. "Naomi," came the voice on the other end, and she could feel the tension in her mother's voice. "Your father is dealing with enough right now." "I know, Mom," Naomi replied, her tone firm. "But there's something wrong. The rumors don't make sense. I have to know if they're true." Her mother sighed, the sound heavy with worry. "You're too close to this. Don't get caught up in it." But Naomi wasn't listening. She hung up the phone, her mind racing, and she wasn't going to stop until she found it. The next day, Naomi returned to the courthouse, slipping past the reporters and the growing crowds. She had a plan. She needed to talk to people who might know more, people who had worked with her father, people who could give her clues, where she was sure there would be records, notes, and maybe something that had been overlooked. As she stepped into the office, a familiar face greeted her. Henry, one of the clerks who had worked with her father for years, raised an eyebrow when he saw Naomi. "I heard about the rumors," he said in a low voice. "I don't know if they're true, but people are talking." "What are they saying?" Naomi's heart skipped. Henry glanced around before leaning in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's been paying off witnesses, and they're trying to make it look like your father's involved." Naomi's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a scandal. This was something much darker. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she knew one thing. She would find out.
To the clerk's office
And she
opened
would
just
stop
then,
it, and a tall figure stepped inside, Judge Harrison. Naomi's eyes narrowed. What was he doing here? And why had he arrived just as she was getting closer to the truth? Naomi, Judge Harrison said smoothly, his eyes locking with hers. You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous to get involved in this. Naomi's mind raced. What was he hiding?
and in that
What did he
moment,
know that
Naomi
wasn't
realized
telling her?
that the whispers weren't just about her father anymore.
They were about her too. Naomi stood still in the clerk's office, watching Judge Harrison walk away. His words echoed in her mind, but the deeper she thought about it, the more she realized something wasn't right. Harrison's insistence that she stay away from the situation, his uncharacteristic evasiveness, it didn't make sense.
It wasn't just his
She
behavior
knew
that
him too
unsettled
well.
her.
It was his timing. Why had he come to the clerk's office the moment she was uncovering something important? What did he know? Her thoughts were interrupted as her phone buzzed, a new message flashing on the screen. It was from her father's lawyer. Naomi, I'm afraid it's happening faster than we expected. They're suspending Judge Bell. The investigation's taken a more serious turn. She could feel the weight of the message pressing down on her chest. Her father, Judge Marcus Bell, was being suspended? The moment she had feared, the one she had tried to prevent, was now a reality. The walls of her office, once familiar, seemed suddenly too close, too suffocating. She put the phone down and took a few steadying breaths. There was no time to panic.
Find out who was behind this and why.
The next morning, the storm of rumors had exploded beyond anything Naomi could have imagined. A forged document had surfaced, claiming that Judge Bell had accepted bribes during a high-profile case. The evidence was convincing to some, but Naomi could feel her stomach twist every time she looked at the signatures didn't match and the dates didn't line up. Still, it was enough to fuel the media frenzy. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It had become a full-blown investigation. And suddenly, Marcus Bell, a man who had spent decades building a career based on his integrity, was being painted as a criminal. The press was relentless, hounding Naomi's family with calls and questions. They just cared about the story. Naomi spent hours staring at the phone, wrestling with the decision of whether to go to the courthouse and face the public or stay out of sight. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that avoiding it wouldn't make the situation go away. At the courthouse, the judicial board would be holding a hearing to address the allegations. Marcus Bell was to defend himself, but Naomi had doubts about the fairness of the process. The stakes were too high, and the cards seemed stacked against her father. Naomi arrived just in time for the hearing. She could feel the tension in the air as she stepped into the press, taking notes and snapping pictures, judges and lawyers murmuring in quiet discussions. It was clear that this wasn't just about Marcus anymore, it was about something much bigger. The fate of the entire judicial system seemed to hang in the balance. Naomi's eyes searched the room, landing on a familiar face.
At the front of the
Judge
room,
Charles,
looking
looking calm and composed, as though he hadn't just testified against his old friend the day before. Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Harrison's sudden appearance in the case. He had distanced himself from her father for months, but now he was playing a major role in the investigation, and his actions were raising tension in the room reached a new level. Marcus was escorted to the front, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the accusations, his face pale. Naomi could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but there was also something else, a spark of defiance. He wasn't going down without a fight. Then Harrison stood. His voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the silence of the room as he having a conversation with a known criminal. Harrison said, his voice clear and deliberate. The conversation was about bribes, and it took place in a public space. At the time, I didn't know the full extent of what was being discussed, but now I can't ignore what I saw. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. Harrison's words were like a slap in the face. How could he say something like that about her father? They were friends, brothers, almost. And yet, here Harrison was, making accusations that could destroy her father's life. The room fell into stunned silence, and Naomi could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. This was the tipping point.
Marcus had
The
no
moment
way to
that
defend
could
himself
ruin
against
against a statement like that, especially when the entire room seemed to believe it. The hearing continued, but Naomi barely heard the rest. She could barely see through the haze of disbelief and anger clouding her vision. Judge Harrison's testimony had done its job. Marcus was suspended from the bench immediately. The public backlash was swift and unforgiving. No one cared about the truth. The media storm surrounding Marcus was growing stronger by the minute. Back at home, Naomi could barely look her father in the eye. The man who had always been so sure of himself, so steadfast in his pursuit of justice, was now broken. The humiliation had taken its toll. Marcus had retreated into his study, his once proud manner now replaced with a heavy silence. Helen tried to comfort him, but even she seemed overwhelmed by the shame that had fallen over them. She could barely hold it together. Naomi watched as her parents, two of the strongest people she knew, seemed to unravel before her eyes. But Naomi couldn't afford to let her father's fall be the end of the story. There was too much at stake. She had to keep going. She had to find out who was behind this. Harrison's testimony didn't add up. The more Naomi thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about bribery. Someone was orchestrating this. Someone who had a much bigger agenda than simply destroying her father's career. Naomi spent the next few days digging through every detail, cross-referencing every piece of evidence. The more she saw a pattern, a trail of lies, manipulations, and cover-ups leading back to someone in a position of power. But who and why? The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they were scattered, disjointed. It wasn't just a conspiracy against her father. It was a well-planned attack, and it was bigger than anything she had expected. There were Naomi unanswered questions, too many lies, and too much at stake. She had to find the truth, no matter where it led, no matter what it cost her. As she sat in front of the evidence, the weight of the situation pressing down on her, one thing became clear: this was just the beginning. The truth was out there, and she was going to find it. Naomi's hands trembled as she flipped through the last of the documents she had gathered. An undercurrent of deception woven through the pages, and the deeper she dug, the more it became clear. This wasn't just an isolated scandal. This was a web intricately designed to bring down her father, and Judge Charles Harrison was at the center of it. Her mind raced as she pieced together the puzzle. Harrison's connections were the city's most influential figures, politicians, businessmen, and high-ranking officials, many of whom stood to gain immensely from Marcus's downfall. They all had reasons to want Marcus out of the way, and now Naomi understood that these people were not simply protecting themselves. They were orchestrating and fabricating the bribery charges. But his involvement went even deeper than Naomi had imagined. She had to be careful. The walls seemed to be closing in, and every move she made felt like it was being watched. Naomi couldn't shake the sensation that someone was following her, that every step she took brought her closer to something, and those in power weren't going to let her uncover the truth without a fight. That night, Naomi stayed up late in her father's study, carefully reviewing the evidence. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. Her heart skipped. It was too late for visitors. She peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. She opened the door cautiously, only to find a single envelope to pick it up. There was no return address, only her name written in bold, ominous letters. Inside was a note. "Stop looking into this, Naomi. Leave the truth buried, or you will regret it." Naomi felt the color drain from her face. The message was a threat, and she knew it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Someone was watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up. She wasn't going to stop. But Naomi did not now. The following day, as she walked to her car, Naomi caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure standing across the street. When she turned her head, the figure quickly disappeared. She tried to shake it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. With each passing moment, Naomi realized that the stakes had risen to an entirely directly in danger. Despite the mounting threats, Naomi pushed forward. If anything, the danger only fueled her determination. She knew her father's name was being dragged through the mud, but it was more than that. There was something far more sinister at play. She couldn't let fear stop her. Her investigation not when she was so close to the truth. When she discovered a hidden safe deposit box, tucked away in a seemingly inconspicuous bank. Naomi had no idea what she would find, but as she cracked open the box and scanned the documents inside, files detailing Judge Harrison's ties to organized crime, correspondence with shady figures, and evidence of his involvement in orchestrating the entire bribery scandal. It was all there. the proof she had been searching for. Naomi felt a surge of triumph. This was it, the smoking gun. The documents in her hands could clear her father's name and bring the entire conspiracy to light. A cold sense of dread washed over her. She wasn't alone. Two men approached her quickly, blocking her path. Their eyes were cold, calculating, and there was no mistaking their intent. Naomi tried to step back, but one of them lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. "Give us the documents," the man growled. His voice was low, menacing. Naomi fought to break free, but the reality of the situation hit her. These men were sent to stop her, to silence her. They weren't going to let her expose the truth. In that moment, Naomi knew she had to act fast. She didn't have time to think. She yanked her arm free and darted toward the door, slamming it open and sprinting into the street. Her mind raced as she looked for an escape, her breath coming in short, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they had what she was carrying. Naomi pushed herself harder, weaving through alleyways and dodging traffic as the city seemed to close in around her. She couldn't stop. She had to get to safety. She had to protect the documents. The chase was brutal. She could hear footsteps behind her, feel the men closing in, but Naomi alley she took was a desperate attempt to escape. She rounded a corner, slipping into the shadows of an old building, and pressed herself against the wall, gasping for air. The men passed by without noticing her, and she dared not move until the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She had barely escaped, but she had the documents. She quickly stuffed them into her jacket and began the long walk back home. The danger wasn't over, but for now, she had what she needed. When Naomi finally reached the safety of her home, she found her father sitting alone in the study. His face was drawn, the weight of the world on his shoulders. But when he saw her walk in, holding the documents, something flickered in his eyes. Naomi said breathlessly, sitting down across from him. "The evidence. It's all there. Harrison is tied to everything, the bribery, the organized crime, everything." Marcus looked at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "You did this? You found the truth?" Naomi nodded. "We have what we need, Dad. Now we just need to expose it." But Marcus's face darkened. "Naomi, it's too dangerous. They'll come after you. You don't Naomi understand." Placed a hand on his. "I know the risks, but I won't stop. Not until the truth is out. We'll expose everything, Harrison, the conspiracy, all of it. Together." A flicker of resolve crossed Marcus's face. He had been broken before, but seeing his daughter's unwavering courage reignited something in him. The fight wasn't over. Documents in hand, not by a resolve strengthened, father and daughter made a plan. It was time to fight back. The conspiracy might have knocked them down, but Marcus and Naomi Bell were about to make sure it didn't get away with it. Naomi stood in the dimly lit corner of their home, the evidence she clutched so tirelessly to uncover, proof of Harrison's connections to organized crime, the forged bribery documents, and the network of corruption surrounding her father were finally in her grasp. But as she looked at her father, sitting on the couch, looking worn and defeated, Naomi knew their battle wasn't over. What they didn't know was that the storm was about to get even more intense, sending shockwaves through the entire family. Judge Marcus Bell had been arrested for assault. The accusation was outrageous. He was accused of attacking a prominent businessman with ties to the criminal underworld, someone connected to the very people who had been trying to bring him down. The charge was a blatant fabrication, a desperate move to destroy the last shred of what she was hearing. It was clear now. This was no longer just about ruining her father's career. This was about silencing him, stopping both him and Naomi from exposing the truth. It was retaliation. Someone had set her father up, planting false evidence to make sure he would never stand in the way of their power again, now facing not just the loss of his career, but now a criminal charge that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was being pushed into a corner from which he couldn't escape. Naomi wasn't about to let that happen. The stakes had never been higher. She had spent weeks uncovering the conspiracy, risking her life and her safety, and she wasn't going to let it all fall apart. Her father's name, one chance to expose everything. With her father locked in a battle to clear his name from the false charge, Naomi knew she had to act fast. The courthouse, the very heart of the system that had turned its back on her family, was where the final confrontation would take place. She couldn't do this alone, but she had no choice. The only person who could help them now was herself. Naomi made her move. Armed with the irrefutable evidence she had gathered, she infiltrated the courthouse, slipping through dark hallways and locked doors, determined to place the documents in the right hands before it was too late. But she could feel it. The danger was closing in. The enemies she had made in her quest for justice weren't the tension in the air was palpable. She had barely made it to the clerk's office when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw two men walking toward her, faces cold and determined. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She was outnumbered, and there was no time to waste. "Give us the files," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. Naomi took a step back, her mind racing. She had only one option, echoing through the quiet halls as she darted between rooms, looking for any escape route. Behind her, the men followed, relentless. The courthouse felt like a maze, its once familiar halls now a trap. But Naomi was driven. She had to make it out. She had to get the evidence to the right people. The chase seemed endless. Naomi ran until her legs burned, until her lungs felt like it could be her last. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. With the documents in her hands, she finally found a way out, slipping out of the building just as the men reached the exit. The next day, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Naomi stood in the back, watching as her father, now released from custody, sat at the defense table, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final showdown. Judge Charles Harrison was already seated at the front, his eyes scanning the room. He looked confident, composed, as though he had nothing to fear. Naomi knew, though, that this was his last chance to stop the truth from coming out. The trial began, and Naomi could feel the pressure. But how could she do so without risking everything? Just as the prosecution began its arguments, Naomi stood, her voice ringing out across the courtroom. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. "I have evidence," Naomi declared, her tone steady but firm. Evidence that Harrison's involvement in the conspiracy to destroy his career. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Naomi didn't back down. She walked to the front, presenting the damning documents. She laid out the connections, the fabricated charges, and Harrison's ties to the criminal figures who had been working against her father. With each piece of evidence she revealed, Naomi felt the weight of her father's name anymore. It was about bringing down the corrupt system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. Judge Harrison tried to turn the tables, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. He accused Naomi of fabricating the evidence, of making up a story to save her father from the consequences of his own actions. But Naomi didn't waver. She had the truth, and it would not be filled with tension as Naomi made her final argument. She spoke not just for her father, but for all the people who had been wronged by the system, for all the lives that had been destroyed by corruption and lies. The judge, Harrison, had tried to bend the law to his will, but now the truth would finally come out. In a stunning moment, the judge overseeing the case stood and declared Marcus Bell's name, and he was reinstated to his position as a judge, his reputation restored. But the victory felt bittersweet. Naomi knew that while they had won this battle, the system that had allowed this corruption to flourish was still in place. As they walked out of the courthouse, Naomi turned to her father. His expression was solemn, but his eyes gleamed with the fire of someone who has fought for justice. "Isn't over," Marcus said quietly. Naomi nodded. The world they lived in wasn't perfect, but they had made a stand.